Good afternoon. My name is Abdullah Verachia. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this Thursday session of the GIBS Flash Forum. I see a number of familiar faces on my screen in front of me, and it's always a pleasure to spend some time with you. And today is a particularly interesting session. It's an interesting session because what we've seen in the macro environment, and really what we've seen in terms of the impact of COVID-19 in the last 3 to 4 weeks, has had a direct impact in terms of how individuals, how organizations, and even how countries take decisions. And so today's session is very much around how do we make sound decisions in critical times like the one we face at the moment. My guest with me today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Helena Barnard. Helena is the head of the doctoral program here at GIBS. She's also a member of faculty at GIBS. But also very widely published in a number of international journals. Helena is an internationally recognized scholar by the NRF and teaches and publishes in many areas, including the area of decision making and innovation. Helena, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Abdullah.
So the topic before us is very much around how leaders or how individuals take decisions during critical times like this year. Helena and I had a discussion earlier on, and I really took out some key nuggets in terms of the discussion I had with her. I found in the discussion I had with her that it turns out that people respond to threats in two main ways. By narrowing their field of attention, simply by simplifying the information sought and the number of channels they use to find that information. And they do this often when they're faced with a threat by concentrating power and influence, effectively by placing it at higher levels from a hierarchy perspective. And the rigidity is bad. And so what we want to do today is really think about how we take decisions in times of crisis. And we're going to cover a number of key areas, including the information process, look at how decisions are taken, and very importantly, how do we actually improve on this? I'm going to ask Helena some opening questions, after which I'm going to interact with you. Please feel free to use the Q&A column at the bottom to be able to ask questions, or please feel free to use the chat column on your right to be able to provide some of your inputs. Helena, let's open up and perhaps really start by asking the question what this threat rigidity is all about. What is it? Where does it come from? And very importantly, what levels does it play out within organizations that you find yourself, or that we find ourselves in?
So maybe it's important to just begin with saying, what is a threat? A threat is something that could be happening that is potentially bad. It's not something that is certain. And a part of our response to that is precisely the uncertainty that is associated with it. And this uncertainty really triggers very bad, rigid responses. And these responses come from a desire as an individual or an organization to safeguard. On an individual level, as you mentioned, the first part has to do with the information that we are willing to countenance. The moment you've got a threat, the airwaves go wild with new kinds of information, different types of information. And as a human being, we need to somehow preserve some cognitive processing power. And we do that typically by simplifying. We do that by simplifying the sources to which we go. We do that by identifying the experts that we will listen to or not. We do that by generally narrowing down the field of inquiry that we're looking at. And if we use an epidemiologist to guide us, that's perhaps better than if we use some self-appointed guru who's going to guide us through this thing. But one of the characteristics that we see is that our desire to simplify, to create the illusion that we have some form of grip on this is so great that at an individual level, we're not always particularly wise in those decisions. And this extends to the organization. We know about groupthink. We know groupthink is bad. But if you're in an organization that's struggling to survive and everybody around you agrees wholeheartedly with you, there's such a sense of satisfaction that it's very easy to feel that this we've got it. We've identified what the core issues are. This then spills over in the decision-making process. In terms of how we make decisions, we tend to, for example, want to be efficient about things. If we think carefully about efficiency, efficiency is about doing what we are already doing cheaper or faster or better. And a threat implies we don't know if we should be doing that at all anymore. So we engaged in a process where our narrowing of our field of vision and our narrowing of decision making creates a very big temptation to stick to what we've already been doing. And very frequently, the decision-making process, as you pointed out, is a process of centralization. There's a leader who makes the decisions. The leader may or may not have a few trusted advisors who will give input. They will typically be selected on the basis of the fact that they say the same things as what the leader is thinking, because of the way that we're thinking in terms of the information sources. So really what ends up happening is you have this decision-making process that's deeply impoverished, where you've narrowed the sources of information and the variety of sources of information, and you've narrowed the number of people who are involved in making that decision at a moment where we actually don't know what the future holds.
So Helena, on that, I mean, as you've rightly said, there's this decision-making that's centralized amongst a group of trusted advisors in a period of significant uncertainty. And we see this playing out with many organizations. As you see, quite a messy landscape with not many answers out there, with quite a bit of complexity and ambiguity. Many organizations hunker down, bring together a very small core team, and that core team takes some of the decisions, and the consequences sometimes aren't ideal. Is it inevitable, given how individuals or how organizations have been used to creating or taking decisions, or is there perhaps another way of looking at this?
So first of all, it's always important to bear in mind that management is about the right answers for the right companies under the right circumstances. So if you've got a very large, traditionally hierarchical organization, and you suddenly try and have a complete culture shock, you're not necessarily going to get people giving you great input, because why me? Why do you suddenly want to hear from me? So I don't want to suggest that small teams of people who are grappling with issues are necessarily bad. But what we know is that if we are able to counter these rigidity threats, and if we are able to, under these circumstances, move towards a process that emphasizes fluidity, there are actually very positive outcomes. So research has been done and found that innovation, for example, is often facilitated by a fluid response under conditions of threat. What happens is the world is changing. What got you to be successful up till this point may not be what is going to lead to success going forward. If you are able to hear the voices coming from different areas, sometimes quite unexpected areas, that may be a trigger for where opportunities in the future will lie. If you are able to broaden the conversation, if you are able to bring in the perspectives of ground level employees, if you're able to bring in the perspectives of suppliers and customers, those things are resources that you can use as part of a sense-making process. So if we think about what's happening, the way that we respond to this rigidity is because we're trying to preserve the conviction that our world somehow makes sense. Sure. But it doesn't anymore. And if we can engage from that perspective and say, suddenly the rules of engagement have shifted, so we now need to do things differently, and you engage in a process of fresh sense making, drawing on as many resources as you can, different partners, different voices in the organization, there is actually the potential of moving into this new era with offerings that fit that era.
So what I find strange or perhaps interesting is that often the best responses that we've seen under conditions in a major threat, supposedly, are those taken by a leadership team based on the sense making that you speak about. And what you're arguing, or what I get a sense of, is perhaps an opposite to that. It's, yes, the ability to be able to have teams looking at the context, making sense of what's going on, but then really looking at a much broader stakeholder environment, including, as you've rightly said, suppliers, people within the broad bench of the organization. I mean, how do organizations navigate that in such a painful or difficult period that we find ourselves in at the moment? And what are some of the risks, obviously?
So I think we've really been privileged to live in a country where our leadership, our political leadership, at a time when it really mattered, stepped up to the plate. But one of the things that is striking is when the lockdown was announced, at that point, Cyril Ramaphosa said, this is new and we will make mistakes. And as we discover what those mistakes are, we will rectify them. If you listen to the media briefings, the medical briefings, it says we know so little about COVID, we're making projections and assumptions based on the knowledge. We're going to have to go back and renew it. So the first thing that happens is, yes, there's a team of people. And if you think about the team of people, we've had ministerial briefings by numbers of ministries, different ministries, all on the podium at the same time. If you look at the team of epidemiologists, it's 25 people from different orientations. So it's been broad-based. Yes, we have one or two people who are the spokespeople, but if you look at what's underlying it, it's broader teams, and there's a very strong message coming out that this is our sense-making so far. We're going to take a step forward, and based on the information that we then gather from the environment as things evolve, we will change it. So in terms of an organization, I think it's very clear that you can't sit around and wait for clarity. I mean, you'll go bankrupt while you wait for clarity. But at the same time, there will be an economy and a global economy after the crisis. We don't know when it's going to happen, but it's not going to be the end of all commerce. So as you go forward to build a coalition that is as broad-based as possible, of people who share the vision and the goals that you have, and then at the same time to communicate and to say we're operating in such a fast-changing environment, our insights may change and information will help us to make better decisions. So I think that in itself, as an organization of whatever your size, is, I think, a very practical example of how to navigate this threat on a practical basis.
So I think what's interesting about what you say, and really relating it to the way political actors have managed some elements of this crisis, and we can see stark differences in terms of different economies around the world, but perhaps using your example of South Africa and the response by the president of South Africa, and arguably some of the learnings, the insights and experiences have come from perhaps his background, right? Being in a trade union movement in the 80s, in the 90s, really being a key player in terms of the constitution making process and bringing different political parties together. And we see it in his approach, right? You've got different line ministries responsible for different elements, opening it up to business, to even the opposition, to members of civil society, which is particularly interesting. I'm going to, before I ask the next question, invite you as members of the audience, please feel free to use the chat column to be able to ask questions, or in fact, there's a Q&A button on the bottom. If you want to ask any questions, please feel free to use that, and so I can bring you into the conversation. But Helena, I spent some time last week really talking about how you build strategy in a crisis on a Flash Forum. And one of the things we spoke about there was, yes, exactly as you've said, we've got to think about the immediate decisions we take perhaps in the next 2 to 3 months. but then really the future. And the future is not always going to be a future that's dominated by COVID, but really the next, right? What does our business, what does our context, what does our sector, perhaps what does the country we live in look like post-COVID? And you've used this concept of innovation, really in terms of this process of decision-making. How do you see innovation playing out in this type of context that we find ourselves in?
Well, one of the things that I think is really fantastic about this crisis is that we are seeing one of the key elements of innovation, which is experimentation, coming up all over South Africa. So most innovations fail. Innovation by its nature is trying out something new, and it may or may not work. But the media has been inundated by small-scale projects of people who are trying to come up with testing stations or ventilators or making masks or trying to deliver food or changing what it is that they deliver. There's been so much small-scale innovation, experimentation, and all of this is part of a larger innovation paradigm. One of the things that have struck me, I do a lot of work in international business, and global value chains were really presumed to be the way that the modern economy is organized. It was simply presumed that the efficiency of a global value chain where you work on what you're best at trumps everything else. And I remember once reading about there's a city in China of 8 million people and they do socks. That's their thing. So I don't know how you introduce yourself to people. You know, I work on left socks or right socks or running socks or what, but how does the South African clothing industry compete with a city of 8 million people working on socks? Well, what we've suddenly seen is that emphasis on efficiency that comes from specialization is perhaps not the wisest one when your global value chains are disrupted, and that the ability to operate in a smaller scale, a more flexible scale, may be really valuable going forward. Now, the point about a threat situation and an experimentation situation, it may be, it may not be. But one of the things that's happening is that we are going through this process, and as South Africans, because we have to make a plan, a boer maak 'n plan, we are busy experimenting in different ways, and many of those experiments will not turn out to have any longer-term economic value. At some point, we will not need as many ventilators as we could possibly be coming up with. But what are the learnings that are associated with it? When I read about the ventilator blueprint, I saw that there's a possibility that this would operate without electricity. And I thought, why do you increase the hurdles for yourself? Don't we just want to save people's lives? And then I realized, even though COVID will at some point end, and it may be a matter of years rather than months, the whole of Africa is desperate for medical equipment that doesn't need electricity. And if thinking around a ventilator that is not as efficient as what GE or whatever has been coming up with, but that can operate without some of the infrastructure that's taken for granted in certain parts of the world, maybe that is an area where South Africa is moving into the future. One of the things that we need to get comfortable with, though, is maybe. So I think this is really one of the hardest things, because as a business person, you get rewarded for being able to act and being able to act fast. And suddenly we're in this limbo space where we need to think rather than act. And we need to think for longer than what we necessarily want. But there's no knowing whether an action now, and I want to differentiate between the actions that you do to make sure that your staff can be paid and don't go hungry, and the actions that you know will allow you to grow 5-10 years from now. that kind of forced strategic rumination, thinking about a longer term future and where we put each other, that comes if we can free ourselves from the rigidity of a sense of threat that my world has come to an end. One world has come to an end. And I just want to detour. I'm Afrikaans, and I'm more or less old enough to remember the end of apartheid. Many people felt the world had come to an end. Oh. And instead, what we entered was a much, much better space. So the fact that a world that is familiar ends doesn't mean, and all the threats that many white people felt at the end of apartheid, it was a sense of threat, and there was lots of rigidity. People were stockpiling food. I don't know if you remember that. It was a classic threat response, and we were wrong. It was a better era than what we had come from. And it's so hard in the middle of a threat to hold on to that.
So, I mean, it's a beautiful point in terms of experimentation, in terms of a new normal, in terms of perhaps how parties who otherwise would not collaborate with each other now have come into spaces where they're going to collaborate with each other. Really, this ability to think about how companies are even experimenting with working from home, experimenting in terms of how they use different technologies, experimenting in terms of how they teach or learn. And I want to link that point around innovation and experimentation in a very uncertain type of context by bringing in Garth de Klerk, who asked the question, Helena, around how do you feel about competition in an environment that really needs aggressive, what he calls collaboration to rebuild. And how do you look at that? Because the argument we've seen is that perhaps we're going to need a lot more collaboration going forward.
So a country like the US has long had quite sophisticated thinking about competition, in that it was understood that competition in the marketplace, collaboration in the marketplace, was not wise. But it was also understood that collaboration on a pre-competitive basis, when what was relevant was the need to come up with basic science, was actually a very good thing. So I think that there's a need to think in terms of competition at different phases of when an offering gets to the market. Obviously, there's something like collusion, but there's also collaboration, which is collaboration in a pre-competitive space. And I think that pre-competitive collaboration is something that South Africa has not been. I mean, there's just been such distrust, for good reasons, between government and the private sector. But even inside the private sector, you know, there's been these very tight relationships for a very long time, and we've struggled to figure out what is the balance of competition versus collaboration. And I think this is one of the wonderful questions that's now suddenly on the table, that suddenly we can say, what do we as a country want to see in terms of competition versus collaboration? What is acceptable for us, and what is it that we actually want to see? Because I think most of us are really heartened by the fact that government and the private sector for once are not just bitching about each other. It's been great to see that we are finding common ground, and that we have different emphases, we have different skill sets, but we have a shared vision, which I think is a gift of this virus, quite frankly.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I want to take you to one of the critical points that you raised around decision making, and very importantly, aligning decision making in terms of how choices are taken by organizations. And I want to really lean into a question from Trevor Hughes, where he asks the question that it's great to have a wide range of different people, perhaps functions or disciplines, and both internal and external stakeholders providing valuable inputs. But his view is that at some stage decisions have to be taken. And the question that he asks is how then should leaders make decisions using these wide array of inputs, in an environment of great uncertainty, but where decisions have to be taken, and how do you wrestle that tension, perhaps a tension between the two?
So when I want to go back to Botswana, to the khotla, which is the traditional way that in Botswana culture decisions are made. So when Seretse Khama wanted to marry a white woman from the UK, way back during apartheid, the Botswana decided we need to have khotlas on this, and the country came together. And it was, I mean, at that stage, Botswana really was nothing much than a few trees. The world journalists descended on the country, and they had to sit around for more than 3 weeks while people were sitting and talking under the trees about, is this a good thing or a bad thing for Seretse Khama to marry a white woman? And I remember reading about it and thinking, I would go nuts after 2 days, because I'm 100% sure by day 3 at the latest, we are not bringing new information to the table. We are repeating things. And for 3 weeks, this went on. And at the end of it, they decided, okay, this is a good idea. I thought again about that when I happened to be in the US with the Bush and Gore hung presidential process. And it took 3 weeks and the decision for the Supreme Court to actually come up, well, whatever court it was, to decide that it was Bush rather than Gore. And one of the things that struck me is that since that decision, those 3 weeks, Botswana has had 0 issues in terms of the fact that their leader had chosen to marry a white woman and the kids of the leader were not entirely white. It's been resolved. The 3 weeks had dealt with it. Now, it's a much, much smaller country than the US, but what struck me when I was sitting in the US and I was reading the bitter debate and experiencing the sense of betrayal by the Gore people, it really struck me that we sometimes have an assumption that a faster decision is a better decision. And yes, some decisions need to be made really quickly, but sometimes the effort to involve and build that alliance, you spoke about Ramaphosa's background as a trade unionist, that ability to build some form of a coalition between different parties, in the end, that really accelerates on the execution side. So as a leader, of course, you know how urgent these decisions are, and you know how much time you have, but the time to pause and to listen to pros and cons, the time that it takes to hear the people who don't easily speak, the people who are maybe having dissenting voices, it feels to me that time to not rush the decision unduly. And maybe, I mean, literally under the Botswana tradition, you have to have full consensus. That's why it took 3 weeks, because it needed to be consensus. Maybe not full consensus. I'm not sure if I'm traditional enough to feel I could live with that kind of process. But I think that the basic lesson in terms of let's pause and broaden the voices. Let's see how close we can come to a consensus view. You know, we are as worried, and I would imagine in many ways more worried than the US about the economic survival of the country. But as a country, there's a consensus that lives actually are more important than jobs. Jobs matter if there are living people who can have jobs, and we can't just allow people to die on a massive scale. That's a profound consensus that as a country we're operating with. And I think many businesses, we have all kinds of challenges that we need to resolve, but I think if we step back and we say we're living in a shifting world order, we're positioning ourselves to be to be businesses that are effective a year and 5 from now, I think it helps to give us that confidence in a decision-making process that's not rushed.
Lovely. I want to maybe lean into some of those elements there. And there's something, Helena, from John Sharp, where he says that he's a Stephen King fan, so he's pleased to see the novel on your bookshelf because he argues that the current situation really brings the book The Stand to mind. And one of the things he asks is that he's found, and I find this as well with so many of the discourses that I've seen out there, that the current pandemic is eliciting mostly binary responses from individuals. And really, I think the argument today is the ability to look more widely. What is your thought on that?
Binary in what way?
That it's very much, a conversation in terms of either just the healthcare outcomes and not looking at some of the more broader, the discussion in terms of lives versus livelihoods that you've spoken about. And so how do you get, from a decision-making process, get as many diverse inputs into the room or into the conversation as opposed to a one-dimensional view?
So I'd like to go back to the experience of the end of apartheid, which if you were white, if you were at that point 40, 50 years old, really felt to you like the end of the world as you knew it. And the anxiety and the fear, and it was literally the conversation that I heard over the braaivleisvuur was a conversation around, is there a space for me or not? That boiled down to, should I leave or should I go? Because I don't mind staying, but is there even a space for me? If we think about where we are now, we are dealing with, yes, there's a very real, immediate, substantial cost dealing with healthcare issues. But the one Greece has also been doing brilliantly in dealing with the pandemic. And the one Greek leader said there's always a substantial cost dealing with a pandemic. The fact that you delay incurring that cost doesn't mean it goes away. If we had hundreds of thousands having to get into hospitals, there would be a cost as well. And he said the more immediately you can act, the bigger the longer term benefits that you have. And one of the things that really came out for me as a South African was it is a disaster that so many people don't have homes, that they can't go and self-isolate properly because they're living 8 to a shack. But this is not news to us. We've known that people are living under really problematic conditions. We've known that people are going hungry. And it almost felt to me like the thinking under apartheid amongst white people, where we kind of suspected this cannot continue, this is not right. But there wasn't a sense of how do we move forward. And I think one of the things that we've learned about this is, as a country, we are at risk because too many of our people are homeless and hungry and haven't had the benefit of a functioning state. And it really feels to me, if we can use this moment as a moment to open up a conversation about, we need to bring our entire population into society. And post-COVID, what we need to do is we need to build a society in which all our people are part of the economy. Then it feels to me it's no longer a binary. Then it feels to me we're not talking, and yes, we are running huge, huge risks. I'm not blind to it. But one of the things that I'm always upset more people don't know is, at the time of the Great Depression, 1/3 of Afrikaans people were living below the breadline. Afrikaans people were desperately impoverished. They were people who didn't have educational opportunities, and so there was a need to uplift the community, and we did it because of all kinds of problematic apartheid-related things. But why are we not showing that commitment and those processes, extending it to our whole population. Suddenly, we know we have to. And that really is why I feel this binary about the health of our people versus the economy. If we can use this to unblock that staleness of thinking that we're the most unequal society in the world, we keep on saying it as if this is a given, that we can't do anything about it. And if this pandemic forces us to shift out of that thinking, think of the market that we're opening up if a third of our country suddenly become economically active.
You know, it lends to a really great point put by Len Murray, where he asks, or he says, you know, perhaps we can leverage this collective, collaborative, solution-thinking mentality, as he calls it, into other fundamental issues, right? So issues of unemployment, you know, education, or global warming that comes together. Helena, I want to, there's a very interesting question that was put forward by Trevor Hughes and by Jacob Madiba. So I'm actually going to invite Trevor to ask the question himself around, you know, online collaborative tools for decision-making. I find it a fascinating question because, I mean, yesterday I spent time with a company on a strategy session, and we did it online, and I found some really interesting elements, but obviously the elements that aren't there. So body language, the ability to use multiple senses. But let me hand over to John to ask the question.
Cool. Trevor?
Yes, hi guys. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. With working with some of my clients, it really is an interesting challenge to see that the leadership not being physically in the office, their ability to walk the floors, not to be able to get together in the exco sessions, as long extended the exco sessions where information is shared and decisions are made, where there's lots of lobbying and working between different leadership members of the exco teams. That's all gone away, and I just keep thinking in my head of a CEO or an MD sitting in his office at home by himself, trying to play a leadership role, and how that leadership role has shifted from that kind of physical space and voice and meetings to one of sitting and connecting with the business from the comfort of his office or a lounge at home, and how that's changed the dynamic of how decisions are made, who influences who, how information is shared, and how do I as a leader can play a role in leading the business when I'm just not there anymore. I'm almost physically away. And many of the businesses that I work with, a lot of the people that are doing the work are still doing the work. They're still at home and they're busy. And there isn't that kind of leadership presence on top of them managing their day-to-day activity. They're almost left alone. And the business is carrying on without that leadership influence or impact on a day-to-day, week-to-week. So the leadership role has changed because of this virtual world we live in. And so the question is, as a CEO or an MD of a business, how to influence, direct, and shape decision-making and priorities, strategic and resource allocation, etc. Thanks.
There's no doubt that it's become harder. All the managers that I speak to say to me, it's taking them so many more hours to do the same work, because things that could have been said in a few sentences now need to be put in an email, or you need to formally invite somebody on Teams or Zoom or whatever. So there's no doubt, A, it's harder. B, we don't really know how this works. I'm sure there's shortcuts that eventually we'll figure out, but we're too early in this process. We don't know. The other thing that I think you're making a point that you're making is that previously you could bump into somebody on the way to the lift. Now, broadly, you need to sit and you need to invite people. You need to decide, am I going to do it in a one-on-one? Am I going to invite 2-3 people in a conversation? So it had to informal consultation and lobbying where the atmosphere.
Helena, we're losing you there. Let me. Helena, if you can just unmute yourself, let me just do that for you.
It seems I've disappeared for a second.
Yeah, you disappeared for a second. If you can just maybe rewind 15 seconds back.
Okay, cool. All I said is that the informal lobbying and stuff has disappeared. And instead, what we're left with is the need to make far more conscious decisions, to reach out to people, to consult with people, whether it's one-on-one or in bigger groups. And there's no doubt that it's an incredibly time-consuming process. We don't yet know how to manage in this context, and the work of leadership has become, I think, thank heavens I'm not a leadership expert, but it's become a huge amount harder at the same time as it's become more important.
I so agree with you. I mean, the only benefit I've seen is that I think it's easier to take decisions with track pants than a formal suit on. But aside from that, nothing else. I mean, it's more difficult, to be able to lobby, etc. Helena, I want to go to one last point. I actually want to bring Jacob Madiba into the conversation. He's got an interesting question, and then we'll wrap up with that question by Jacob Madiba. So, okay, so Jacob's microphone isn't working, so I'll ask the question on his behalf. His question is very much around strategic considerations in terms of supply chain. I think one of the impacts we've seen is massive shifts in terms of supply chain disruptions. And a lot of this is uncertainty in terms of where certain countries are in terms of their supply chain, etc. And so you're dealing with multiple geographies. Do you have some thoughts in terms of how you deal with some of the supply chain disruptions from a decision-making perspective, obviously? Hello. I think we've lost Helena. But let me, Jacob, I'll make a commitment from my side that I get Helena onto that as well. I want to perhaps use this opportunity to really thank Professor Helena Barnard for, I think, such an important conversation in terms of sense making and the importance in terms of understanding what's happening in the contextual environment. And then the very critical point in terms of how do we take decisions in periods of crisis, and how do we take these decisions in such a way that we really look at multiple stakeholders from a decision-making perspective. And very interestingly, the point around how does the right type of decision-making and the way in which we take decisions actually impact elements of innovation, etc. I think it's been a fascinating conversation looking at all of these elements here. Helena, thank you for your time and your valued contribution today. I think it's important that we have conversations like this here, as I think many people, as I've seen in the chat, are grappling with some of the challenges in terms of decision making. I want to give you a minute if you've got any last closing remarks from your side before we close off this session.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. For some reason, my connectivity is starting to go wonky, so I think that's maybe a sign I've said enough. I think that for me, the key message is simply if we can go through this space and somehow remember to remain open to the possibilities and not paralyzed by the challenges. There are massive challenges, and they are to a certain extent paralyzing. But we are also entering a new era, and there are possibilities in this era. And let's practice the fluidity and the openness to see them when they start to emerge.
Lovely, thank you so much. I think new possibilities, new decisions, and perhaps some very interesting innovations that might come out. I think that leads us to maybe perhaps me inviting you to tomorrow's session, where we have Dr. Jonathan Marks, who teaches in the area of entrepreneurship and corporate entrepreneurship. Jonathan tomorrow will lead a session in terms of entrepreneurship and specifically the gig economy. I think it's an environment that has had interesting changes in the last few years, perhaps accelerated in the last few weeks. So tomorrow, the Flash Forum at 2 p.m. I want to thank Professor Helena Barnard, thank all of you for participating in this conversation, and look forward to future interactions. Thank you very much.